Today we are talking about Berserkers Shield, but we've already done that recently, so why are we talking about it again? A question that came up quite often in the comment section of that very video was, does Berserkers Shield work on hunters? And that's what we're gonna explore a bit today and look at the stats and what we can find out. Beforehand, I'd like to hear from you guys if you generally would like a meta where something like Berserker Shield with a little bit of protection would work on hunters, or if you'd rather have your hunters as squishy as possible and are not a fan of that. Remember, there were metas that had at least part of that in the past a little bit, but it never was all that popular. Usually the high DPS builds kind of outshone those with a little bit of defense. At this point, a disclaimer is absolutely necessary. We cannot look at all options, all eventualities, all factors that play a role when it comes to Berserker's Shield, because effectively there are so many different situations with different hunters, with different scalings, fighting against different opponents that will lead to very different results. But we can get a bit of an idea on how good this item is. And in order to do that, we do 3 different comparisons, with 3 items each, so 9 comparisons in total, with quite a lot of numbers. The first one is just one at level 7 with Hunter's Blessing, in this case without any stacks because I didn't feel like stacking a little bit onto that but not fully stack it. And then with either Berserker's Shield, Devourer's Gauntlet or Asi. And then the next part is at level 13. In this case, we'd still have Hunter's Blessing, now fully stacked, Berserker's Shield, Ninja Tabi, and an unstacked Transcendence. The same thing with Asai as well with the Transcendence. And in the case of Devos, we would, instead of having the Transcendence, have a Crusher at that point. Crusher simply because it's easier to calculate here. You could obviously also go for something like a Kaival and go with the Steel, but then you would have the stacks and all that kind of stuff. You could also get Executioner at this point already, but then we'd have to do the percentage penetration specifically for Devos. So a few options here, but this seemed like the most easy and comprehensive one, I would say. And then the last one is at level 20 with a full build. In the case of both Berserker's Shield and Asi, the rest of the build would be Odysseus Bow, Ninja Tabi, Transcendence fully stacked now, Executioner, and Bloodforge for some extra lifesteal that way as well. With Devourer's Gauntlet on the other hand, we'd go Ninja Tabi, Crusher, Executioner, Odysseus Bow, and Bloodforge in that order. This build isn't what you would probably normally build most of the time, it just makes things a little bit easier to compare. Don't worry, I haven't forgotten about crit builds as an option with Devos, which usually make a little bit more sense, and obviously you don't necessarily have to go into Bloodforge. You could also go into Titan's Bane, but again, we're using a squishier target here, so Titan's Bane really wouldn't have that much of an impact, and the Oboe just does a little bit more overall. And you will see in the results that it's not really necessary for us to understand what effect we have here. Now let's look into the stats. With Berserker's Shield, our power is 96, with Devos is 101, and with Asi it's 71. The attack speed for each of them is 1.19, 1.04, and 1.28. So Asi, a little bit weaker in regards to the power, obviously, as it doesn't have any power, but a little bit more attack speed. In terms of lifesteal, there is no lifesteal on Berserker's Shield. You have 10% lifesteal on Devos, unstacked, and then you have 15% lifesteal on Asi. And in terms of penetration, both of the first ones have none and Asi has 10 penetration. We also need the HP value from Berserker's Shield because that is used for the healing. The target we're going against will only have the base protection, so that will be 36 at level 7, and that brings us to the DPS. Now the DPS unmitigated here don't really matter that much. What we are interested in are the mitigated values. And those are 84 with Berserker's Shield, 77 with the unstacked Devos, and 67 with Asi. So you actually have a DPS advantage in early game, despite not having any penetration, just through the power and attack speed mix that's very, very beneficial in combination with Hunter's Blessing as well. That means at the start of the game, Berserker's Shield is actually the best choice that you can make. And that's further emphasized by the DPS against someone with Berserker's Shield. We can see that here as well. 76 if that target has Berserker's Shield and you have Berserker's Shield, but with Devos it's just 70 and with Asi it's just 60. So even less damage output from the enemies, and obviously also less damage taken from minions if you tend to play aggressive in lane. And I think that's one of the big strengths of Berserker Shield. You can simply aggress in lane and worry a little bit less about the minion damage coming in on you. Then you obviously also have the lifesteal part. We already talked about the lifesteal values above, and now we're talking about how much lifesteal that results in per second, as we have the attack speed and the damage that has to be factored in. With Berserker Shield, again, there's none. With Devos, you have 8 lifesteal per second, and with RC, you have 10 lifesteal per second. However, Berserker Shield has its own heal, and that heal actually results in 12 heal per second. So, despite not having lifesteal, Berserker Shield comes out on top in terms of early game healing. On top of that, it also restores a lot of mana, so that's an additional benefit that you can keep in mind as well. RC can obviously do a little bit more here as well with its passive, a little bit of healing, but that is something that only matters in specific scenarios when it comes to boxing and sustaining, so not really relevant. There's a good reason why RC is typically not built that early into the game, and this should show it a little bit more. It just lags behind in this regard. I just wanted to have it in there to have a comparison option with lifesteal and attack speed, or sustained attack speed. Now at level 13 we have a half-finished build. In this case, Devos would be stacked and the Hunter's Blessing is stacked. Transcendence, for those builds that have it, is not stacked yet. And at this point the table slowly starts to turn a little bit. What we can see here is that with Berserker Shield you have 214 power, with Devos you have 217, and with RC you have 188. The other stats you can quickly glance over here as well if you'd like. The important ones for us are at the bottom. The target that we're going against now has 54 protections, and our Medusa has 1471 HP. The DPS with Berserker Shield is therefore 222. With Devourer's Gauntlet, having a little bit of pen through the Crusher now as well, we have a total DPS of 258. And with RC, we have a total damage, or DPS rather, of 221. However, we have to factor in here once again that if you're going against somebody with Berserker Shield, they also get those extra protections. In this case, Devourer's DPS drops to 233 and RC's DPS drops to 206. So not too much of a difference here yet. Devos gets a little bit more DPS at this point, though it's relatively minor, and Transcendence can be a little bit more stacked depending on how well you found as well, and that can kind of shift it around a little bit. So this is really situational still. At the same time, the lifesteal is something that is less situational. We can directly look at the total healing per second here, or total sustain per second, because we know how it works now from the last one. In this case, Berserker Shield has 24 healing per second, Devos has 62 healing per second, and RC has 33 healing per second. So obviously a major difference here in favor of Devourers, especially when it comes to the sustain, almost 40 more. But what you have to keep in mind is that there is also trading with abilities. Especially at this stage of the game, abilities still have a decent impact on your overall damage output. It's not just all the DPS, the basic attacks, and as such, protections come in very handy here, because abilities don't do lifesteal unless you have Soul Eater, which we don't, and the protections will still lower the ability damage. So even though the DPS might be slightly in Devil's favor, there's still benefit in Berserker's Shield here, depending on the situation. The question is really, how much lifesteal do you get off in a short period of time? How much can you benefit from it very, very quickly? And depending on that, it may work out for you or may not work out for you in your favor. It also depends on how much you're boxing into a wave, because that would mean that you can take more damage from the minions, but at the same time you can sustain better on the minions with Devos. So it's just a back and forth. I would say Devos is a little bit favorable at this point, but it's something that can be easily shifted with some trans stacks as well. But then at level 20, things shift completely. I've already talked about the builds, so we're not going to go through them again entirely. With Berserker's Shield, we have 336 in-hand damage now. With Devos, we have 292. And with the RC build, we have 311. That translates into quite a bit of a DPS difference, actually, when we look at the raw stats. But after the penetration and execution and everything being factored in at this point, the DPS look somewhat similar. With Berserker's Shield, our total damage here is 485. Devos, it's 458 or 426 against a target with Berserker's Shield. and with RC it's 501 or 468 against a target with the shield. So DPS wise things shift a little bit again due to the fact that Transcendence gives you so much raw power, and the Crusher as an addition can't quite compete with that in the Devos build here. So you can see how there is a little bit of a shift for even RC coming out on top here, and how Berserker's shield can kinda mitigate a decent amount of damage at this point still. But on the other hand, Berserker's shield gets completely crushed when it comes to sustain. Due to the fact that we have Bloodforge now, we get a little bit more, 73 plus 44, 116 total sustain per second, but Devos gets 179 and RC gets 150. And Devos could get even more here with a crit build, significantly more, so this is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of potential for the sustain that Devos can have. And obviously a crit build could also out DPS this build heavily, so there's a lot of things going on here that swing things heavily in Devourer's Gauntlet's favor in the late game. So in conclusion, if you are building into Berserker's Shield, you should definitely make sure to switch it out late game. It can give you a lot of early game presence, it can give you a lot of bully potential in lane, similar in a way to Ekival. It can also help you a lot with mana sustain from what I've experienced, which can be very good for certain guards. There are some guards that I think can still make very good use of it instead of a sustain item, because DPS wise, again, you don't lose that much depending on what path you're going, and as long as you build Transcendence later, you can make up for that. But you should have some other way of sustaining. So I think the guards that can make better use of it, if they want to try it out, are the ones that have self-sustain, such as Cupid or Neath. Those that are not as dependent on lifesteal. For them, the extra protections also basically increase the effective healing that they get from their own healing abilities, so it's all very beneficial overall. In the end, I still think that Berserker's Shield should not be the primary choice in most situations though. If you really want to use it on a Hunter, you might consider replacing Hunter's Blessing with it, for example. That, in my opinion, makes more sense than just using this as an extended starter item, because that is a purpose it can fulfill pretty damn well. While I expect Berserker's Shield to see nerfs in the future that will probably affect its viabilities for Hunters as well, it's also worth keeping in mind that next patch we will have Heartseeker coming in, probably shifting the Hunter meta altogether anyways, but there could be some interesting stuff going on with a build that starts with Berserkers, goes into whatever, Heartseeker Boots and then Trends, or Boots, Heartseeker Trends, or similar, where you stack relatively late and have all the early aggression and advantage through Berserker's Shield as well as Heartseeker that you can get, and an incredible amount of mana sustain especially. So we'll see how that works out. And with that, thank you guys very much for watching. I hope this was interesting and insightful and gave you a bit of a better overview of this item. If you're new to the channel, feel free to click the sub button and maybe the bell, it really helps me out. And other than that, see you for the next one tomorrow. DukeSloth, out.